This is a review of the GMKtec Nucbox K8. It contains an AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS CPU with an integrated Radeon 780M GPU. So what does that mean? Let's go ahead and take a look at the specs of the CPU. So here is the AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS, and it is an 8-core 16-thread CPU up to 5 GHz with a 45-watt TDP. Now, we'll go ahead and take a look at that in a little bit, but it can actually be boosted up, despite it saying 54 watts here, all the way up to 65 watts. It does support PCIe 4.0 with 20 total lanes, so this thing does come equipped with dual M.2 PCIe 4.0 X4 M.2 slots, and we'll go ahead and check the performance of those. And then it can support up to 256 gigabytes of RAM, but I only have two 48 gigabyte RAM sticks that we can go ahead and throw in there and take a look as well. As far as the graphics, it has the AMD Radeon 780M, and it's actually a pretty powerful GPU, and I'm going to benchmark that against the GTX 1050 Ti and the Radeon RX 6400, both desktop GPUs inside of a desktop PC, of course. And this little PC can actually hold its own against those GPUs, playing most games at 1080p high settings. With FSR on, it can actually manage newer games like Black Myth Wukong and Warhammer Space Marine 2 at well over 30 FPS. Granted, that's at low or medium details. Let me just preface this review by offering a great big thank you to GMKtec as they provided this sample for this review. I'd also like to state that this video is a long video, but I do my best to cover all aspects of the device that I find may often be overlooked by other reviews. Now, individual sections should be timestamped though if you just want to check out certain things about it. And let me know in the comments if you like this detail, or if you're more inclined to enjoy shorter overview videos, or if you'd rather see a series of shorter videos about different features. So let's take a closer look at the hardware itself. It's your typical mini PC form factor that you get from GMKtec and other manufacturers. And I'd consider it the big brother to the GMKtec M6 that I reviewed recently. This one comes with the AMD Ryzen 5 6600H with a 660M GPU in it, whereas this one, as we already talked, has the 8845HS CPU with a 760M GPU. Definitely a step up, but the price points actually reflect that as well. This is going to be cheaper than this, obviously, by about $100 or so. So if we go ahead and take a look at the ports here, we've got the CMOS reset button, the power button, 3.5mm headset jack. Now this is a USB4 Type-C jack. So not only does it act as just a regular USB-C port for transferring data, it can also act as a power input for the device itself, even though it has a separate power connector in the back. And it can also do display out up to 4K 60 Hz through DisplayPort. And it should be connected directly to the PCIe bus as well. And we'll take a closer look at that. Now here you've got two more USB ports. They're Type A, USB 3. Looking on the back, you have two more Type A ports, USB 2, USB 3. And you have two full-size video outs, a DisplayPort and HDMI. Then two Ethernet jacks. Now these are 2.5 gigabit Ethernet jacks. Kensington lock. And there is the power connector for this guy. I'll show you the power supply in a second. And clearly you've got the fins for the CPU cooling there. Then looking at the other sides here, you've got the vent here, same thing on the other side, and on the bottom you have some more cooling holes there as well, and then mounting point on the bottom, then rubber feet. Now as far as the power supply goes, you've got the power jack here that I already showed you, right? And so that's a barrel connector, and the power supply that they give you is this 19 volt 6.32 amp 120 watt total power supply. Okay, now I'm going to open this guy up, and if it's anything like the other GMKtec boxes I've reviewed, effectively it's just pop open the top cover just like that. And then you've got 4 screws to remove the fan. So there's the fan, GMKtec, DC 5 volt 0.18 amp. Got this small pin pitch 4-pin fan connector. And then there's the DDR5 RAM. And then the two M.2 ports with the Lexar PCIe Generation 4x4 1 terabyte drive in there. Now one problem I had with another GMKtec device that I was reviewing is that when I put in a second M.2 drive here with any kind of heatsink, it would crash into the fan. So if we plug this SN770 into here, now there is no heatsink on here. Now if you look closely, you can see the SSD in there. So this doesn't seem to have a problem securing down. But now let's go ahead and take this out, and then we will transfer this guy over to here. And I think you'll see that it interferes with that fan, so I can't even secure this down now, right? It's actually hitting hard, hitting hard to that heatsink on that SSD. So that's an issue that they still haven't resolved yet. Now I do have these super thin copper heat sinks here. If we take off this heat sink, see that there? Okay, great, that broke. So if we check the thickness of this guy with the pad on it, you're looking at about 3.8 millimeters. Then I've got these copper heat sinks that I can put on there that are only about 1.7 millimeters thick. So I'm going to leave the stock heat sink on the one that came with the system and leave it in the outboard port. But then I'm going to use this thin heat sink on this WD Black SN770 so we can test the port throughput with that. Now for the test, this should be able to go in here without a problem. Well, it seems like it's able to secure down, but I'll go ahead and screw it down and go from there. Oh, there we go. This PC comes pre-installed with Windows 11 Pro. Once I booted up the first time, I went through the Windows setup process. I stayed disconnected from the internet, and it did not ask to connect to the internet or even create a Microsoft account. It's good to see GMKtec remove that requirement in their custom Windows build. Once in Windows, there were no extra apps. It was a clean installation. Windows was activated without any issue. All devices in the device manager were detected and had drivers, and updating Windows went perfectly fine as well. I then proceeded to run a full antivirus anti-malware scan of the system, and after scanning for about 2 hours, it came back completely clean. Now I also did do a clean install of Windows, but I'll show that later in the video. Here's a quick look at HWinfo64 on the GMKtec K8. You can see here it's got the AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS, and it's set to a 54 watt TDP. Even though by default the normal TDP is 45 watts, it is adjustable up to 54 watts, at least according to the specs, and so it looks like it is set to the maximum TDP. I'll take a closer look in the BIOS later to see if that's actually adjustable. And here's the chipset, the AMD Promontory, Bixby FCH. The BIOS date is March 18th, 2024, 1.07, and the memory is 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM, and it's running at, if we go into Task Manager here, you can see better. We've got 5600 mega transfers per second, and it's set up in quad channel. Now it's quad channel even though it has 2 sticks of RAM, because DDR5 apparently runs in dual channel mode in each single stick. So combined that would be quad channel. And then there's the AMD Radeon 780M integrated graphics. It has 3 gigabytes allocated to it for video RAM. I'm going to see again if I can adjust that in the BIOS. And then lastly, there is the NVMe, which is a Lexar NM7A1 1 terabyte NVMe. Here's a quick look at the BIOS. You can see the Nucbox K8 version 1.07, dated March 18th, 2024. The EC version 1.0201, Ryzen 7 8845HS, and the Lexar SSD DDR5 RAM. Under the advanced setting here, we got auto power on, BIOS flash enable, wake command, USB boot, power limit select, and it's set to balance. But if you look over here, you can see that actually balance mode is 54 watt, quiet mode is 35 watt, and it can actually bump all the way up to 65 watt. We'll just start with the balance mode, and I'll actually adjust those later and kind of test performance and thermals based on that as well. S5. Now graphics configuration, looks like you can actually change the amount of VRAM all the way up to 16 gigabytes. Well, this is 32 gigs in it, so I'm sure it's limited by the amount of RAM that you have in there, but default is 3 gigs. Again, I'll take a look at that, see if that really helps performance, because some games are pretty VRAM hungry. Trusted computing, TPM, CPU configuration, and I/O port access, M.2, 1, 2, and LAN and onboard audio, and then secure boot, boot options, and that's about it. Here's a quick look at the SSD that came with the system. It's a Lexar SSD NM7A1, 1 terabyte, and it is a PCIe 4.0x4 NVMe drive. And you can see here's the quick crystal disk mark results. PCIe 4.0x4 should be able to reach a theoretical maximum speed of about 8,000 megabytes per second. So I'm going to be using this SK Hynix Platinum P41 PCIe 4.0x4 NVMe SSD, because this can achieve 7,000 megabytes per second or a little bit faster than that, so it should be able to push the limits of the M.2 PCIe 4.0 x4 slot. And then I'm going to be using this thin copper heatsink that I used on the SN770 so that we can validate the cooling performance of the system with even just a basic flat heatsink like this. So here is a Lexar SSD that we looked at already, the stock one that came with the machine. And here is the SK Hynix P41 SSD here, and it is showing up as an NVMe PCIe 4.0 x4 SSD. And then if you look over here, I did do a quick sequential test and crystal disk mark of both the Lexar, the stock one here, and then down here we've got the SK Hynix SSD, and you can see here it exceeds well above 7,100 megabytes per second. So it's definitely performing up there and able to achieve the higher speeds that PCIe 4.0 x4 should provide. Now to stress the disks and get a good temperature reading on these, I'm going to be using Hard Disk Sentinel, so it can actually do a full disk sweep of the drive, a full disk read, so it should stress the disk near 100%, and we can get a good idea how well the cooling on this K8 can manage those SSDs at full load. So we're about halfway through the test. We've been maintaining about 6,000 megabytes per second, and the SSD temperature has not exceeded 60 C so far, and you can see here it is definitely stressed at about 85 to 90% the whole time. So the Hard Disk Sentinel performance test has completed, and the blue represents the SK Hynix P41 SSD, and the red represents the stock Lexar 1TB SSD. And you can see the performance here of the P41 is about 6,200 megabytes per second throughout, slight dip right there. And the stock Lexar 1TB is about 5,200 megabytes per second throughout. And keep in mind, the reason why this ends here is because it's a 1TB SSD versus a 2TB SSD for the P41. But more importantly, how about the temperatures? Now the blue again represents the SK Hynix, the darker blue represents the controller chip temperature, the lighter blue represents the NAND chip temperature where your data is stored, and the red represents the Lexar stock SSD. First of all, if we take a look at the controller temperatures, it started at about 55 degrees Celsius and ramped all the way up to about 80 degrees Celsius and then seemed to remain steady throughout the rest of the test. And as far as the NAND chip is concerned, it started at about 52, ramped up to about 62, 63 Celsius through the rest of the test. And then the Lexar seemed to fare much better, and it kind of remained steady at about 72 degrees, 73 degrees Celsius throughout the controller, and then about 53, 54 Celsius on the NAND chip itself. So it seems like the cooling performance is actually pretty good. And this one's a little bit lower too, because remember that the Lexar also has that thicker heatsink on it compared to just the copper heatsink on this SK Hynix P41. Next, I'm going to test the throughput of each of the USB ports on this device. And to do that, I'm going to be using this USB4 to M.2 NVMe adapter. And while it is USB 4, this is a 40 gigabit port, but this device itself only supports PCIe 3.0 x4, which will put it closer to about 32 gigabit or about 4,000 megabytes per second, as opposed to the 5,000 megabyte per second that this port can handle. So it'll be a little bit less, but we can at least verify that it can handle those higher speeds and not just operating at a typical USB 10 gigabit port or something. So here's the WD Black SN770 2TB SSD and the USB 4 adapter. You can see the interface is showing as NVMe, and it is connected at PCIe 3.0 x4 speed, so that's going to be our limitation due to the USB 4 adapter, whereas the SSD itself can handle up to PCIe 4.0 x4. And the crystal disk mark result over here, you can see here there's the result, 3,165 megabyte per second read and about 2,900 megabyte per second write. Now this is the SN770 and the USB 4 adapter, and I'm going to take this 1 gigabyte folder here, which is actually 10 1 gigabyte files. I'm going to click and drag it over to the SK Hynix P41 drive here just to get a real world performance estimate. You can see there it's running at about 3.2, 3.3 gigabytes per second. Now I'm going to swap out the USB-C cable here for a USB-A cable so that we can test the other USB-A ports. So I've completed testing on all of the USB Type A ports. We have the three 10 gigabit ports, the USB 3A front left, USB 3 Type A front right, USB 3 Type A rear lower. Then on the rear upper is a USB 2 Type A port, so that's why you have the slower performance here. But 10 gigabit is what these ports are performing at. Now let's take a quick look at the Ethernet adapters, and you can see here we've got Ethernet 2 connected at 2500 megabit, so it is a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet controller. Same with the other one. I don't have it connected currently, but I will check that in a second. And if we go into Device Manager here, you can see it is just a Realtek Gaming 2.5 gigabit E family controller, so it is a Realtek chip. Now I do have an iPerf 3 server set up on another machine, so I can go ahead and test the throughput that way. So we're getting about 2.37 gigabits per second, which is pretty typical for a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet adapter. I'm going to disconnect and then connect the other port. Okay, we're connected to the other adapter. Confirm that by going into here, and now you can see that we're connected at 2500 megabits, and do the same test. And there you go, same performance. And then I'm going to actually do a file transfer, an actual file transfer from the local machine here, the GMKtec K8, over to a remote machine here, over 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connection, 10 gigabytes of files. You can see there it's maintaining about 275 megabytes per second, which is pretty typical, 275 to 280. Now let's take a look at the Wi-Fi card. It is the AMD RZ616 Wi-Fi 6E or 802.11ax. Now I don't have a 6E router, but I do have a Wi-Fi 6 router. So we're going to go ahead and validate the performance through that. And again, we'll do a iPerf 3 test real quick. Now this router is within like 10 feet of the PC. About 750 megabits per second. Then doing an actual file transfer, 10 gigabytes. To check for CPU performance, thermals, and fan noise, I ran Cinebench R23 to stress the CPU. During the test, the CPU clocks maintained about 4.2 GHz and CPU temps peaked at around 90 degrees Celsius. While Cinebench is running at stock TDP, the power consumption is right around 85 watts. The fan noise is pretty loud though and apparent when the CPU is fully loaded. Now let's take a look at the performance of the AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS while it's running the Cinebench R23 benchmark. As you can see here, the CPU usage average is at about 99%, which is what you'd expect, and these little dips represent when the end of the scene is rendered, then it starts over again, it's going to drop in performance and peak right up to the top again. The core temp average, as you can see here, it shot right up to about 90 degrees Celsius, and it stayed there throughout the remainder of the test, and it did not thermal throttle. I can see here the core clocks across the way here averaged about 4122 megahertz, and for the most part it remained pretty steady, had little dips here and there. And overall the CPU TDP average was about 47 watts throughout the entirety of the test. Now we can take a quick look at the Cinebench R23 benchmark results, and here's the GMKtec K8, and it had a score of 15351 on the multiple core test and then 1699 on the single core. Then I benched that against the AMD Ryzen 9 5900X desktop CPU, and the GMKtec K8 has 8 core 16 threads, and the desktop AMD Ryzen 9 has 12 core 24 threads, and Cinebench is pretty much linear based on the number of threads or cores that you have on your system. So this is about what you'd expect as far as performance wise. Then also here it is compared with a 6 core 12 thread GMKtec M6 with the AMD 6600H CPU, and then a desktop with an Intel i3 10105, 4 cores 8 threads. Now the interesting thing here is that you've got the single core performance of 1699 versus the AMD Ryzen 9 5900X of 1536, so it actually bested it on a single core performance benchmark. I also ran a handbrake, which is more or less an FFmpeg test as well, for H.264 encoding performance. I took effectively a 10-minute long 4K 60 video and converted that to a 1080p 30 FPS video using the fast 1080p setting and Handbrake. And here you can see the GMKtec K8 with the AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS, and I ran it both with the CPU as well as using the integrated GPU, and QSV is for Intel's version of QuickSync video, and VCE is AMD's version of that. So effectively it's a hardware acceleration for encoding. I also benched that against the RTX 3080 in my desktop computer using the NV encoder as well. You can see here that the GMKtec K8 with the VCE actually outperformed the RTX 3080 in this particular instance, so that's pretty impressive. And here is the CPU result of the 5900X versus the 8845HS, not a whole lot far off. Then also we've got the GMKtec M6, Intel i3, and AMD 5600U CPU just for comparison. Additionally, I ran a 7-zip performance test. It took a folder with 22.8 gigabytes and 1065 files, and here's the results. And here you can see it's pretty much on par with the GMKtec M6, and much better than the desktop i3 10105 or the 15-watt AMD Ryzen 5 5600U CPU. Now, while the fan noise can be quite noticeable at load, when idle and with light use, the fan is barely audible, if at all. And at idle, the power consumption is only about 10 watts. 4K video playback was perfectly fine in Windows and ran smooth with very few dropped frames. While streaming that 4K content, the power consumption was anywhere from about 15 to 20 watts. Now these values are all with the stock 32 gigabytes of RAM and 2 SSDs installed. So here is the K8 connected with an HDMI connection to this 4K 60 monitor. You can see right here that it is running at 4K 60 Hz, and it can go up to 60 Hz right there. So here's the K8 connected over DisplayPort in the back to this 4K 60 monitor, and as you can see it is running at 4K 60 Hz with 30 and 60 Hz available. Now I have a USB-C to DisplayPort and a USB-C to HDMI cable here, so we can take a look at the USB4 port here, which should be display capable. Now it may only be able to work with DisplayPort, but we will also check HDMI. So here's USB-C to DisplayPort. And if we take a look here, we can see that it is again 4K 60 with up to 60 Hz. And now with USB-C to HDMI. So with this USB-C to HDMI cable, we're only able to get 4K 30 Hz out of that guy. So here's a quick summary of the resolution refresh. It was able to do 4K 60 on everything except the USB port to the HDMI. That may just be a limitation of the cable itself, and also the monitor I was using is only capable of a maximum 4K 60 Hz. So it may be able to go to a faster refresh, but I wasn't able to validate it to that. So far we've seen that this USB-C port can operate at about 3000 megabyte per second transfer speed with the adapter I had. And it also was able to produce 4K 60 output using DisplayPort. And lastly, you can actually power this device with a USB Type-C adapter. This is up to 100 watt max. It has a USB-C connection on it. So you notice that there is no power adapter here. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in this USB-C port, and you should be able to power this device with this here. Now I left the lid off of here for now. So we're all plugged in. Go ahead and power on. And there we go, we are now in Windows. So now I'm going to go ahead and stress test this using Cinebench R23. While the system is being stressed here, you can see it's actually pulling about 60 watts. So as long as you have the appropriate USB adapter, it should have no issue powering it through that USB-C port. However, when running the same Cinebench R23 benchmark with the stock power supply, it was drawing upwards of 85 watts. Upon closer inspection, you can see that with the USB power supply, the CPU only runs at about 3.5 gigahertz, compared with 4.1 to 4.2 gigahertz when using the stock power supply. If you look at the CPU package power then, with the USB power supply, it is only running at 35 watt TDP, whereas with the stock power supply, it is able to run at the stock 54 watt TDP. But I will show you in a minute that the performance isn't gimped much at all by running at 35 watt TDP versus 54 watt TDP, and you also get the benefit of a quieter and cooler running system. Then I unplugged the USB power adapter and plugged in the regular power adapter. Next, I went into the BIOS and went over to the Advanced tab here, down to Power Limit Select, And there you have the power limit for the CPU, and by default it's set to balance, which is a 54 watt TDP. Now I went through and set the quiet mode, which is 35 watt TDP, and then also to performance mode, which is 65 watt TDP. Then I benchmarked those for a few items for performance, thermals, and noise. So we've gone ahead and looked at this performance chart here for the stock TDP for the CPU running Cinebench. Well, I went through and dissected each of these metrics here, the core usage, CPU package power, and core clocks, and I adjusted the TDP and the BIOS for each of those three instances, and we can compare that here. So here's the CPU usage, which is what you'd expect while running Cinebench 23, effectively 100% across the board for each of the three instances, 35 watt, 54 watt, and 65 watt TDPs. As far as CPU temperatures, running at 35 watt TDP, it is running much cooler, about 10 degrees Celsius cooler, maybe a little less as it goes along the test here, but you compare that with the 54 watt and 65 watt TDP, it's pegged at 90 degrees Celsius. Now as far as the CPU clocks, the 35 watt TDP effectively leveled out at about 3.7 gigahertz, whereas the 54 watt and 65 watt TDP, there really was not much difference. Slightly better on 65 watt TDP, but nothing real substantial. And if we take a look at the actual TDP of the CPU while running Cinebench R23, setting it to the 35 watt or quiet setting in the BIOS, it hit right around 35 watts. Setting it to the balance mode or 54 watt TDP or the stock setting, it actually ran at about 47 watts average. And setting it to the performance TDP or showed 65 watt in the BIOS, it actually ran at about 49 watt average TDP. And if we take a look at the actual performance results running at the different TDPs, you can see here that 35 watt is not a whole lot slower than the stock 54 watt TDP, and the 65 watt really isn't that much better than the stock TDP either. I also used Handbrake to validate the performance, and you can see here that the stock 54 watt took 450 seconds, whereas the 35 watt took 464 seconds, so it really isn't that far off at using considerably less power and generating less heat. Now when it comes to total power draw from the wall at the different TDPs, you can see here with idle use and light use in browsing, it really isn't going to make much of a difference. Now when it comes to stressing the system, like with Cinebench, if you look at the 35 watt TDP, it only drew about 58 watts versus 85 watts at the stock TDP. And then at 65 watt TDP, it even drew 10 watts more. And when it came to gaming, same kind of situation. You're looking at 64 watts with 35 watt TDP, 90 watts with the stock 54 watt TDP, then 98 watts when you run up at the 65 watt TDP. And if we take a look at some actual gaming benchmarks while running at the different TDP settings, you can see here that the performance really wasn't any different, regardless whether or not we ran at 35 watt, 54 watt, or 65 watt TDP. Now that being said, at 35 watt TDP, the Horizon Zero Dawn and the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark both did exhibit some stuttering throughout the benchmarks, while these other ones did not. So I'm not sure if that is because of the TDP setting or what, because at the higher TDP settings that stuttering went away. And when running at 35 watt TDP, you benefit from a much quieter fan. So next I'm going to go ahead and try and install Ubuntu. I was able to successfully install Ubuntu 2404, no issues. You can see here we've got the AMD Ryzen 7, 32 gigs of RAM. Go to system details here. Everything seems to be working out just fine. You can look at Wi-Fi here, and it's recognizing some networks. Go to the Ethernet here, connected at 2500 megabits. Second one's not plugged in. We'll check on that in a minute. Display, which is a 1080p 100 Hz monitor, and it has 100 Hz shown here as an option. That's good. Sound seems to work.
Front, left. Front, right.
Now, just like we did within Windows, I'm going to go through and test the performance of the M.2 slots as well as the USB4 port, and I'm going to use both FIO or FIO, however you want to pronounce that, as well as KDisk Mark, which is similar to Crystal Disk Mark in Windows. So we can go ahead and take a look at the disks that are in here. You can see here we've got the SK Hynix P41 here, the Lexar stock SSD here, and then the WD Black SN770 here. So the SK Hynix is the NVMe 0N1, Lexar is NVMe 1N1, and the USB Type 4 is showing up as an NVMe 2N1, so an NVMe drive. So it's good that it's detecting that as an NVMe drive and not typical USB. Now here's the file configuration file I'm going to be using. It's an NVMe sequential read running for about 30 seconds, 256K block size, and I/O depth of 32. So the FIO disk benchmarks are completed. Now I'm going to run kdiskmark. And first I'm going to choose the stock SSD, the Lexar. So here are the results of those M.2 SSD benchmarks. We have the file read, kdisk read, and kdisk write with the SK Hynix P41 and the M.2 inner slot, the Lexar stock SSD and the M.2 outer slot, and the SN770 and the USB adapter, the USB4 slot, as well as the SN770 moved over to the USB 3 Type A slot. And these results are very similar to what we see in Windows, except it seems like the SK Hynix is running a little bit slower than in Windows. But either way, we can see that we are definitely approaching that 7,000 megabyte per second threshold that the SSD can manage. Now, as far as the network connection, I'm going to do a quick iPerf3 test here. That's your typical throughput. 4K video playback in Linux was perfectly fine and ran smooth with very few dropped frames, very similar to Windows. However, the power consumption was upwards of about 25 to 30 watts while streaming that content, compared to about 20 watts in Windows. Since I was in Ubuntu, I decided to set up a Plex media server to see how well it managed transcoding multiple 4K videos to 1080p. While AMD does support hardware transcoding through their integrated GPU using VCE, it does not seem to be nearly as efficient as Intel's QuickSync or NVIDIA's encoding engine, at least when it comes to Plex. So to test this, I served up 4 4K videos and played them simultaneously, and unfortunately at least 2 would pause and buffer periodically. The CPU usage stuck around 50 to 60%, and RAM usage was only about 20%, so I'm not sure what the concern was. So needless to say, this machine isn't really the best option for Plex transcoding. Of course, streaming regular videos without transcoding, it will perform perfectly fine, but you can achieve that with any machine much less powerful than this. Now let's talk about what you probably really want this machine for, gaming. This little beast is capable of putting out some serious frame rates at medium or high settings for most games or running at a 1080p resolution. And with the help of FSR, it can easily reach 30 plus FPS in newer demanding titles like Black Myth Wukong and Warhammer Space Marine 2. And can even play more demanding older titles like Cyberpunk 2077. I ran a number of gaming benchmarks at 1080p low and 1080p high settings so that you can get an idea for the range of performance. Before running the gaming benchmarks, I made sure to go into the BIOS to set the VRAM to 8 GB total so that it would not be a bottleneck. I also installed the latest AMD Adrenalin Edition version 24.8.1. Now the GMKtec K8 is represented by the purple bars here. This value here represents the average FPS for that particular benchmark, and then the darker regions represent the 1% low FPS value. Now I pitted that against the GMKtec M6 here in green, then also a desktop PC that had an i3-10105 CPU, but I put in a NVIDIA GTX 1050 Ti as well as an AMD Radeon RX 6400, and then ran those benchmarks all with the same settings. Now the dotted yellow line represents the 30 FPS threshold. And you can see here at 1080p low settings, the K8 is a very capable gaming machine. With pretty much all games, the average FPS and 1% low FPS are well above the 30 FPS line. Now changing the graphics settings to high, the results were remarkably just as good. Now for Black Myth Wukong and Cyberpunk 2077, I did turn on FSR3 as well as turn on frame generation, so that way we could get a reasonable frame rate. And surprisingly, the Cyberpunk 27 achieved about 75 frames per second with that setting turned on. And then Black Myth Wukong actually was at a playable 42, 43 frames per second. And again, in many cases, the K8 was able to compete with the desktop with the RX 6400, and it even bested it in several of these games as well. Now, besides the built-in benchmarks, I did play several games for a little bit, like Black Myth Wukong, Cyberpunk 2077, and Warhammer Space Marine 2. Now, that's not shown here because there's no built-in benchmark. But they were all very playable at 1080p low settings, and at 1080p high settings in Wukong and Space Marine 2, there were some instances of FPS drops to about 20 FPS or so, but running at lower settings, it played without any issues. Now, while most of the benchmarks were done in Windows, I also did run several gaming benchmarks in Linux using Steam and Proton, and I tracked the FPS metrics with Mango HUD and G-Overlay. Although I did notice that the frame rates in Windows were a lot more smooth and consistent than they were in Linux. Now, as you can see here, the benchmark results are actually remarkably similar. Seems like the 1% low FPS is a little bit lower when running in Linux, but for the most part, the average FPS is up there with the same performance in Windows. Now, I already showed this earlier, but I thought I'd bring it up here because I did test several of these games running at the 3 different TDP settings, the 35 watt TDP quiet setting, 54 watt TDP balance setting, and the 65 watt TDP performance setting, and for the most part, they all pretty much performed at the same FPS. And as mentioned before, though, at the 35 watt TDP setting, in a couple of benchmarks, Ryzen 0 Dawn and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, they ended up stuttering a little bit at the 35 watt TDP setting. And but once I bumped it up to 54 watt TDP, it seemed to run perfectly fine. All these other games ran perfectly fine at 35 watt TDP, so I'm not sure what's going on there, but just something to be mindful of if you want to try to bump down the TDP and try to play games. And then lastly, here's the power draw when playing at the different TDP settings. Obviously at the lower TDP, we're going to have much lower power draw, and it's significantly lower, and it also resulted in a much quieter fan. Now it's time for some upgrades. There's not much I'm going to do here, but I am going to install this M.2 2230 adapter into the Wi-Fi slot. This is a 1 terabyte MP600 Corsair Mini SSD. I suspect that slot's probably a PCIe 4.0 1x speed, which would be about 2,000 megabytes per second, which is pretty substantial. And I'm also going to be installing these dual 48 gigabyte sticks of RAM for 96 gigabytes total, and see how that goes. So there's the Wi-Fi card right there, and you can see it's a MediaTek, and it's 802.11ax, Wi-Fi 6E. So I'm going to remove that and replace it with the M.2 E key to M key SSD adapter. I can leave a link to this adapter in the video description if you'd like. First, I'll install the adapter. Now that that's installed, I'll install the SSD. There's that. And now I'll swap the 32 gigabytes of RAM with 96 gigabytes. And there you go. This will also give us an opportunity to do a clean install of Windows. So I just did a clean install of Windows 11 Pro, and I installed it on that M.2 2230, and I now have 96 gigabytes of RAM in here as well. And so this is a clean install, so I don't have any apps here to show you much, but you can see here there's the SSD, and then here's the RAM, 96 gigabytes of available RAM. So RAM was detected no problem, and it's running at 5600 megahertz. I'm not connected to the internet yet. Go to Device Manager here, and there are a number of devices that are not detected. So I'm going to go through the whole update process and see how many devices are still remaining and if we can get these actually updated appropriately. So Windows completed going through all its updates. There were still some missing device drivers here, so you have to go over to the GMKtec website in order to grab them. So to get drivers from the GMKtec website, they used to have a link to this page. I don't know why they don't anymore, but it's at gmktec.com/pages/firmware update. You can see here the driver link right here. And K8 is listed on here. There we go, K8. And you've got Windows 10 and Windows 11 drivers. So just go ahead and download those. Now make sure that you're logged into your Google account. Otherwise, it will say that quota has been exceeded. But it seems like when you're logged in with your Google account, it'll allow you to download it. Now once I downloaded the files and extracted them, I put them in several different folders. I ended up zipping each folder individually so I could upload them to VirusTotal because they have a size limit. And so each set of drivers all came back completely clean, so there's no issues there. So once you extract the files, it gives you all the folders for the drivers, and then it also gives you an install.bat file here. And we can go ahead and take a look at it. And it's effectively just this pnp-util/add driver, so pretty straightforward. Just go here, right click, and make sure you have to run it as an administrator, otherwise it will say you don't have access. And you can see here in Device Manager, everything is cleared out now. So here is the Corsair MP600 Mini, which is at M.2 2230 NVMe SSD that I plugged into the adapter that went into the Wi-Fi card slot. You can see here it's a PCIe 4.0 X1 slot, and the SSD itself can support up to X4. So we should easily see about 2,000 megabytes per second here if we do a quick crystal disk mark test. I'm just going to do the sequential here. Okay, so here's the results, and we have about 1,750 megabytes per second read and about 1,724 megabytes per second write. So that's right up where it should be. And so you can actually make use of that slot with another SSD if you want to. So in total you could support up to 3 SSDs if you'd like. Alright, now I've got these two SK Hynix Platinum P41 SSDs, 2 terabytes. I'm going to put each of these in each of the M.2 slots in there and boot off the Wi-Fi slot with that Corsair Mini that I already have in place. Okay, so I have the 1 terabyte MP600 Mini in here attached to the Wi-Fi adapter. Then I've got the 2 SK Hynix P41 SSDs here. Also note that I do not have heat sinks on here, so I'm going to see how well this cooling fan can keep these cool without a heat sink. Alright, so here are the 2 SK Hynix P41 SSDs. So I ran Crystal Disk Mark on all 3 disks in here, and you can see that I've got the MP600 Mini, which we already looked at. And then we've got the 2 SK Hynix P41 SSDs and the 2280 slots. And they are running at over 7,000 megabytes per second, and which is approaching the theoretical limit of about 8,000 megabytes per second for a PCIe 4.0 X4 performance threshold. Now, while I was just running the Crystal Disk Mark test, the temperatures did skyrocket to over about 70 degrees, and so that's not a good sign. So it's definitely going to need some form of heatsink on those SSDs. Just for giggles, I went ahead and created a RAID 0 or a striped array of those 2 SK Hynix P41 drives. So let's go ahead and do a Crystal Disk Mark test on those. So you can see here the one SSD is running at 72C, the other one at 66C. And there's our performance. It's not quite double, but it's getting close. 12,700 megabytes per second read and 13,000 megabytes per second write. And lastly, let's disassemble the unit and take a closer look at the cooling solution and change the thermal paste to see if it offers any thermal improvements. Now, with the top cover removed, there are 4 additional Phillips head screws that are securing down the motherboard. Now, with those screws removed and a little bit of anxiety-inducing flexing of the plastic case to remove the motherboard, it eventually slid out free and fairly easily. Now, just be certain to take care of the Wi-Fi cables that are soldered to the front of the case so that they don't get broken off. And there is the cooling solution here. Looks similar to the M6 that I disassembled recently. Now, to remove the heatsink, there are 3 screws holding down the fan, and then you need to carefully peel away the thermal sticker closing the gap between the fan and the heatsink. There's the fan, and it's a tiny 4-pin. Then there will be 4 tiny screws securing down the heatsink to the CPU. Now, in order to access 2 of those screws, you need to peel back the thermal sticker that's on the heatsink, and then that will expose 2 more screws through the indents in the heatsink. And with those 4 screws removed, there we go. And if you're curious, it's about a 3mm thick heat pipe. And then with the heatsink, it's about 15 millimeters. There's a close-up of the die. So I'm going to repaste it with this SYY 157. Now let's plug it back in and hope for the best. So I ran a couple of performance benchmarks here to check the temperature difference before and after the repaste. And here we've got the Cinebench R23, and the solid lines represent before the repaste and the dotted lines represent after the repaste. Now, first thing you can see here is the CPU package power. Previously, before the repaste, it was hitting about 47, 48 watts throughout the test, but it was able to maintain a solid 54 watt TDP throughout the test after the repaste. Then we go ahead and look at the temperature difference here in the green. The dotted line is after the repaste, the solid line is before, and you can see here it creeps up temperature a lot more slowly than without the repaste, and the total delta temperature was about 6 degrees Celsius after the repaste. Now we did a similar thing with Cyberpunk 2077, and the benchmark, I ran it a few times. Here's like a section of 2 of those benchmarks here. And if we go ahead and take a look at the temperature here, you can see again that before the repaste, it was hovering up here right at around 80 degrees Celsius, whereas after the repaste, it had a drop by about 4 to 5 degrees, and your total average delta T was about 4.3 degrees Celsius. Now, regarding the GMKtec K8, I think it is a great overall performer, coupled with great features like dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports, a USB4 port, and 2 M.2 PCIe 4.0x4 NVMe slots. It is a very powerful PC and is a great compact solution for gaming and general desktop use. It was very solid and stable throughout all the gaming and testing too. Now the only downsides are that you are limited to a very thin SSD heatsink for the inner M.2 slot, and the fan noise can be quite loud under load. That being said, with the thin heatsink, the SSD temperatures with a full disk read test remain comfortable, and the fan noise can be mitigated by switching to a lower 35 watt TDP profile in the BIOS, and that really only reduced the overall performance by a few percent while getting the benefit of a quieter and cooler system. Now at the normal price of about $550 US, it is a bit expensive, but you'd also be hard pressed to build a regular desktop PC at that price point with the same amount of performance and features. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, talk to you later.
Your death will not go unpunished.